Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Seekers session for March. I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. And let's say hi to Jay Coakley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Welcome. So tonight is an especially poignant occasion for me. It marks 10 years that we've been doing the Seekers Forum. It was in March 10 years ago that I had the idea to start a community for people like myself who are non-sectarian, devoted to awakening and open to new ideas. So we've been doing it ever since. Our community is growing. I want to thank all of you for supporting us, being a part of our community. So without further ado, why don't we get right to it? So this month, we're going to be looking at nonconformity. The program is called Build Your Own World. Why nonconformity matters. Build Your Own World is something that Ralph Waldo Emerson devoted his life and work to, this idea of self-reliance and what spiritual self-reliance actually means. We're going to be examining the importance of nonconformity as an essential part of spiritual life and waking up to our authentic nature. Now, as Emerson said, to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. He also says that we, quote, a man must consider what a rich realm he abdicates when he becomes a conformist. Now, the realm that Emerson is talking about, and that all spiritual teachers talk about, is the sovereignty over our own lives and decisions, the capacity to choose our own way. When conformity becomes more important than truth, when we trust society more than ourselves and the opinions of other people, we grow deaf to what Emerson called the whisper only we can hear, and we orient ourselves toward imitation. But imitation is a surefire path to a second-hand life, as well as a betrayal of our own potential. Now, we can certainly have role models and learn from the examples of other people. But when we try to remake ourselves in their stamp, we dissociate from our own lives. Spirituality is about freedom first and foremost. It's about cutting through material and superficial appearances to discover what is real, eternal, and fueled by love. Unlike organized religions, most of which demand loyalty, obedience, exclusivity, subservience to authority, and adherence to certain forms of worship, forms that they consider more worthy than other forms, spiritual life doesn't care about any of those things. The only conformity required for spiritual awakening is a commitment to the truth, including the truth of our own nonconformity. The only loyalty we require is a commitment to freedom, to self-knowledge, and to happiness, to liberate ourselves from the confines and distortions of the selfish ego, which imagines itself to be separate and autonomous. Now, this is an aspiration that is not at all easy to achieve. It's far easier to adhere to dogma, to assume a group label, to learn the rules and regulations and then shape yourself to fit into some posse or other, than it is to follow your own direction or choose the road less traveled. Giving our power away to groups, as Emerson puts it, saves us from the vexation of thinking. When we're part of a group, we are saved from the vexation of thinking for ourselves. Now, there's great relief in being part of a group, however. We love being part of the majority and turning over responsibility for our welfare to some authority or tradition or group. As social beings, we take enormous satisfaction in being team players and cooperators and members of something bigger than we are. And there are times when we're meant to cooperate, of course, to conform to the higher good. But there are many, many other occasions when conformity is counterproductive and when we compromise our freedom unnecessarily. We do this in order to dodge the effort required to stand up for our own convictions. Now, nonconformity is especially important in times like these, when the dominant culture is corrupt or unfair. In an era like our own, when so much in the world has become unhinged, it is imperative that we practice critical thinking. We're called on to use common sense and discernment in a time when so many wisdom values have simply been turned upside down. When we stand up for what we know to be right and what is true for us, we thrive. When we stand on the conviction of our experience, we prosper. And science has proven this, has borne it out. Studies in nonconformity show us that doing your own thing is actually good for your health. Nonconformers tend to be happier, stronger, and higher functioning than people who go along with the crowd in order to be liked. There was one very interesting study that was done and explored the physiological differences between saying no in order to fit in with others and saying no in order to follow our own path. When the goal was to say no in order to fit in with those who might disagree with them, their cardiovascular responses were consistent with the state of threat: trembling, rapid heartbeat, lowered oxytocin levels. But when the subject's goal was to be an individual in a group of people who might disagree with them, cardiovascular responses were consistent with challenge, improved blood flow, cardiac efficiency, increased oxytocin. In other words, your wellness depends on whether you're motivated by fear of non-acceptance or driven by the desire to stand up for your own beliefs. As one of the researchers in this experiment put it, quote, "The experience of challenge is more like feeling invigorated than overwhelmed. It's consistent with seeing something to gain rather than focusing on what can be lost," unquote. But of course, nonconformity comes at a cost. Everything that matters is hard, as I say all the time in the Seekers Forum. It's harder to swim against the tide, even when doing so promises great benefits. They did another experiment in which subjects were encouraged to agree with incorrect information. And it was found that they would acquiesce to the majority and agree with answers they knew to be wrong 32% of the time. Can you imagine? 32% of the time. We lie just to get along. And knowing that, it's no wonder that fake news, which was an unknown phenomenon 10 years ago, even though it existed, but that fake news has become such a fast-spreading virus around the globe. We will agree with one another just to get along, even when we know that what we're saying isn't true. Peer pressure to agree with those whom we value leads us to band together around lies and damaging belief systems. Even when we know that something is probably false, when those around us are vociferously defending it, it can just require too much social capital to go against the majority, right? We tell ourselves it's just not worth it. Because, of course, we are programmed to obey as social animals. We have a hardwired impulse to keep up appearances, to want others to see us as good, even when being bad is, in fact, more virtuous, helpful, and liberating. That reminds me of John Lewis, the late, great civil rights activist and congressman, who encouraged us to get into good trouble. Get into good trouble. As Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, quote, "Good men must not obey the laws too well." Good men must not obey the laws too well. Beleaguered by racial inequality, economic injustice, environmental betrayals, and a myriad of other social evils, we see that nonconformity is in fact essential if we hope to be part of the solution. And yet we're encouraged to mistrust ourselves, to live with shame, to live with fear. It's wired into many religions and cultures, this tendency to believe that we're bad at our core and that only salvation, redemption, and obedience can save us from our animal nature. Cancel culture actually thrives on this self-hating cycle, this ethos of self-hatred. In the noxious atmosphere of cancel culture, we're encouraged to assume the worst of other people, to refuse mercy, to define individuals by their worst mistakes, and also to maintain an ideal of virtue that is simply untenable and ultimately damaging. Majority rule must not override the self-aware person's innate sense of equality and justice. Because consensus reality, what we take to be the right thing to do, is so arbitrary and fluid. What a society deems to be right derives from a specific people and place and a time period. And it may have very little application in other contexts. I did a book years ago called Ethical Wisdom, and There's a section in there with all the ridiculous laws that are still on the book. People are actually still obeying these antiquated, absurd laws that no one has bothered to clean up. So conforming to ridiculous rules is just ridiculous. Now, like conformity, consistency isn't always a virtue. And consistency is something that we are taught that we're meant to be consistent, stay consistent. But sometimes a consistency can be a tragic flaw because contradictoriness, paradox are baked into the human equation. Life isn't consistent. Life doesn't conform to our expectations. And to be consistent in changing situations can be deadly. You can't respond wisely to life's shifting demands when you're constantly focused on consistency over spontaneity. And that's why, as human beings, we are predictably irrational, as everyone knows. And that's how it's meant to be. We are meant to be predictably irrational, not consistent and not conformist. As one philosopher put it, quote, "An ape that in any circumstances conceives of a banana as the highest good will be at a constant disadvantage to a creature that is able to assess the importance of a banana depending on the circumstances." And that's our human condition. If you're always looking at the world through the eyes of a hammer, everything will look like a nail. To be overly predictable in an unpredictable world is a disadvantage. Habit can easily lead you to overlook changes on the ground. So, how do we cultivate nonconformity in our lives? That's really what we are here to explore. How can we cultivate nonconformity? And one path that I'd like to suggest is cultivating and recognizing our childlike qualities. Our childlike qualities, so important in spiritual life. Spontaneity, flexibility, curiosity, eagerness for new beginnings. These youthful qualities help us to remain flexible and supple and honest through the changing conditions of our lives. And that is, of course, why the mystic child has been celebrated throughout the ages as an archetype of potential. As Wordsworth wrote, "The child is father to the man." When we trust this untutored part of ourselves, we align ourselves with our own intuition and also with fresh experiential ways of knowing. Youthfulness brings openness, it brings vitality, possibility, brings freedom from prejudice and self-defense. And it also brings the hunger for experience. It engenders receptivity to mystery and to revelation. As Jesus says in Matthew 18:3, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, we've all heard that passage many, many times, but what does it really mean? What does it mean to become like little children? What Jesus is suggesting is that unless we retain a measure of innocence, we lose touch with our higher intelligence and the most profound truths of who we are. We need to drop the know-it-all mask of adulthood in order to see our original face. That's very important. When we choose discovery, growth, evolution over conformity, we move with the forward flow of life that's bound to oppose the majority current sometimes. 2,000 years ago in Athens, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus said much the same. He said, quote, "If you try to be something you're not, you end up a pathetic dabbler." If you try to be something you're not, you end up a pathetic dabbler. But nonconformity requires an element of shamelessness. And that's a virtue in spiritual life that is vastly underestimated and hardly ever discussed, which is why I bring it up a lot in the Seeker's Forum. Shamelessness is something you don't get taught in church or temple or in the monastery. Shamelessness doesn't mean having no shame. Shame over wrongdoing has its purpose. There's a social reason for feeling shame when we've done wrong. But shame of the toxic, chronic, self-inflicted variety is something else. So referring to that kind of shame, we learn that shamelessness points to egoic freedom. It points to liberation from the need to conceal ourselves, to tamp down our power, to obey, because we secretly believe that we're bad. Shamelessness is actually part of the process of transcending our attachment to appearances and the strictures of our constructed identity. When we're stripped of self-consciousness and the urge to compete, the ego actually loses its foothold, which is great news for the spirit, even though it can be bad news for our popularity or our ability or desire to fit in. Everyone knows that we live today in a kind of ongoing popularity contest. I think of it as the popularity industrial complex that has just amped up our need for likes and winks and nods and strokes to a frightening and adolescent degree. Many people now conform and compete online for popularity and social approval as part of their daily routine. This is a new thing. In the age of influencers and TikTok and so much information, much of it fascinating, streaming at us from all directions, conformity can have insidious, damaging effects to how we live. We're not even aware of the ways in which we're being influenced. But spiritual traditions counsel shamelessness. Spiritual traditions don't care at all about the popularity contest that we call the social contract today. Throughout history, you find examples of men and women who have thrown off the shackles of social acceptance in order to live as their free and natural selves, their awakened selves. They're sometimes represented as tricksters or fools, these enlightened folks who transcend the moral matrix and experience their essential freedom. If you saw the movie The Matrix, you could say that they choose the red pill of reality over the blue pill of delusion and entrancement. One of these was Diogenes of Sinope, who predated Epictetus by several hundred years. Diogenes was a character. He refused to wear clothes and paraded around naked in the streets of Athens, and he actually lived in a kind of a tub on a public street. And Diogenes was the ultimate nonconformist. He was actually the founder of a school of philosophy called Cynicism, which is a different kind of cynicism than we refer to it today. The cynics of that time were simply nonconformists. They were people who refused to play by social rules. They celebrated what in Greek is called avoia, or shamelessness, as a way of opposing what they called the nomos, N-O-M-O-S, of society, the laws, the customs, the conventions that members of a society take for granted no matter how absurd they might be. But there comes a moment in every seeker's life when she realizes that the shame she is carrying no longer belongs to her. When she sees this shame as a fossil from another person's story. As she practices, she learns to brush this shame off, kind of like a cobweb, into the waste bin of harmful illusions. It's no longer necessary, the seeker realizes, to impersonate a guilty person or hide herself under a bushel of stories about wrongness and sinfulness and despair. Instead, she realizes that she has a chance to build her own world, to choose how she sees, how she lives, responds, and connects. When we learn on the spiritual path to say no without apology or aggression, just as easily as we say yes, we eradicate shame and we increase self-belief. We also make space for others to not conform as well. And it helps us to stop being so damn controlling. We learn that intimacy means allowing the imperfection of others to touch the imperfection of ourselves. When we overcome the fear of being known by lowering our guard and speaking from our heart, we step into our full humanity. And that is why nonconformity matters. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about nonconformity. And now, Jay, why don't we pull up the prompt and we'll do a little writing. I'd like you folks, please, to take 15 minutes to write about when the urge to conform interferes with your ability to be authentic. When does the urge to conform interfere with your ability to be authentic? We will take 15 minutes to do that, please. I'll call out the time every 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together as a group.